One of the best indicators about someone's general or overall mobility is their ability to touch their toes. Just by watching someone attempt to, or touch, or go beyond their toes will tell you actually a lot about someone's strategies for movement. Now, I cover this in more depth inside my program, Total Body Restoration, but in this video, I want to go through the 2 essential movement skills that you need to be able to touch your toes. So if you're that person who can't touch your toes, you can use these skills to bridge that gap. So we're going to start off by explaining these skills and the biomechanics behind them, and then we'll jump into a couple of example exercises. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So to be able to touch the toes, we need to have access to motion both at the spine and in the pelvis and hips. So you'll see here as I touch the toes that my spine and my pelvis move back in space. And as that happens, I round at the spine, fold over, and then easily touch my toes here. And there's no stretch or pull associated with that. So when you're first learning, you might have a stretch or a pull, but over time, if you're coordinating this correctly with these motions, you should basically be able to touch your toes without stretching at any time. So let's dive into what's happening at the spine first and then at the pelvis second, and then we'll get into the exercises after that. So in standing, we're gonna tend to have a little bit of an arch here in the low back. We call that lordosis. As we go into this position, we need this entire spine to move back in space, but we also need it to change shape. So instead of having this lordosis, we reduce that lordosis or move into what's called kyphosis, which is just this backwards rounding shape like this. So instead of being concave, we actually want this part of the spine to look convex as we go into the toe touch. So we're gonna think about moving that lumbar spine back in space, and then we're gonna fold over that. And what we should see at this point is actually a nice distributed rounding shape here with no areas that are flat when compared to the other. Now, once we're in this position, if we do see those flat areas, often at the level of the pelvis here or the lower rib cage, we can actually think about pulling the guts in from the bottom and then reaching the spine up toward the ceiling. That's going to allow us to relatively compress the front of the body and expand the back of the body. And if we have nice uniform expansion here, then we've taken care of the spinal motion that we need. Now to complete the toe touch, we need movement here in the pelvis. That's going to allow us to move this back and eventually bring those hands down towards the ground. Now, if we're looking here in the pelvis, when we move back, what we're gonna see if we exaggerate the motion is that the leg here is gonna turn in relative to the pelvis into internal rotation. And as you'll see, this outlet part of the pelvis here opens up a little bit. Now, if we have a tight, restricted lower pelvis like this, then as we try to move back, we're not going to be able to shift back enough to then be able to reach down. In that case, you might feel tight hamstrings, and if you just force it without this area opening up, you might risk overstretching those hamstrings a little bit. So instead, what we want to make sure that we do is get some degree of internal rotation here at the actual hip, which allows us to open the outlet. We can then translate that pelvis back in space while maintaining the rounded shape in the spine, and that's what's going to give us that nice, easy, effortless toe touch. So now that we've broken these down, let's go into a few sample exercises that you could use to restore motion both in the spine and in the pelvis. All right, so the first skill we need to be able to do is to flex the spine. Now there's a lot of variations that we could use for this, but the one that I'm gonna focus on here is gonna be the most specific to the toe touch. And this is just going to look like the beginning of the movement itself. So we're gonna take the hands and we're gonna put them right on the front of the thighs like this, and we're gonna practice just rolling down from top to bottom. So what we're gonna think about is actually kind of flexing the ribs down here to start. And then from there, we're gonna continue to round as we reach those arms straight down. And we're gonna actually just get a real partial kind of a range of motion here. It's gonna almost feel like a crunch, but we wanna see if we can think about doing this by allowing the back to shift backwards in space versus simply crunching down in the front. So even though we are going to crunch in the front and there will be some compression here, we want to think about expanding the back, moving down segment by segment as we go down. So starting at the lower rib cage, allowing segment by segment to travel backwards in space. We keep coming down, we keep coming down. And then as we get a little bit lower, we're probably going to feel some stretch here. The hips have not really moved back yet. From here, if we want to play with it a little bit, we could then move the hips back and get the rest of the motion there. Now, if you're not quite ready for that and you want to break it down, I would suggest just going with this first part. Lower rib cage, kind of pulling the belly in a little bit, as needed, rounding down segment by segment, and then just coming back up. Top, a little bit lower, always pushing the spine backwards, really getting that rounded position, maybe feeling a little bit of a stretch in the back, then rounding back up or unrounding. Now to add another layer to this, we could think about pulling the guts in and up to push the spine up and back. So what I mean by that is we're still gonna go through our crunching kind of motion here, but we're also gonna pull the abs in, almost sucking the guts in from all directions, and we're gonna imagine that we're pushing the guts backwards and upwards in space. We can do this on an exhale. This often works really well. And if needed, you could actually add something like a medicine ball and then pull that medicine ball in to create some more passive compression on the front and passive expansion on the back. Now, as you might notice with the hinge, when it comes to the internal rotation, when it comes to this rounding, we can actually have differences side to side. So if that's the case, we can simply stagger the feet, and it's gonna mean that we're gonna expand the side of the foot that's back. So in my case, I have a harder time expanding the right side here. So I'm gonna put that right foot back. I'm just gonna send that spine kind of straight into that crunched position, right back in space. I'm gonna get a little bit more opening on the side of the foot that's back. So I'm gonna have about 70% of the weight in the back foot, 30% in the right foot. I kind of shoot that back. I get a nice opening here. Exhale, pull my guts in and back. If I'm doing it with this right side back, I might think of pulling the guts from the left, back up and to the right. It's gonna really help me open up this side here, and then I can simply kind of curl back up from that position. Okay, so now that we've covered how to get that rounded position in the spine, now let's cover how to get that internal rotation within the pelvis. So internal rotation is gonna be a motion that turns the leg in, but we're gonna be able to get this actually best at about 90 degrees of hip flexion. So this kind of an angle at the hip. And internal rotation when we're at this angle is actually a rotation upward of the leg relative to the pelvis, or thought about in reverse, it's actually a movement backwards of the pelvis relative to the leg that causes that leg to acquire that position of internal rotation. When we think about specifically how we're doing this in a toe touch, we're gonna have both feet planted on the floor, so we really wanna work specifically on the skill of pushing that pelvis back and acquiring that internal rotation-based position as a consequence of the pelvis moving mainly on the leg. So because of this, something like a simple hinge can work really well, where we focus on keeping the back relatively flat and then pushing the pelvis straight back in space. Now, one thing to be careful about here is that if we just let the back round here and we don't relax the glutes at all, we might actually start to feel stuck, or we turn our hinge more just into that kind of reach down position. We're actually gonna need to open up this area here. So in this particular exercise, what we might do is stiffen up the low back just a little bit, think about relaxing the glutes as we're shifting back, and then feel the upper legs just ever so slightly turning in relative to that pelvis. Now, once we're here, we can remember that skill that we had from the rest of the toe touch, from rounding the back. We can actually push that spine up toward the ceiling, exhale, pull the guts in, and then we should be able to reach down. So this is a nice way immediately to integrate this or to practice this in isolation. If we're practicing in isolation, we push back, we feel this area open up, then we simply come back to the start, doing a number of reps, pushing back, coming up, keeping that low back relatively straight, or we keep that back straight, come here, open up the glutes a little bit, and then from this position, we can push the spine up toward the ceiling, exhale, reach down, and then we should be able to do that pretty easily. Once we have that ability, then we want to see if we can just go from that standing position, hinge and round at the same time, and easily touch the toes in a coordinated, smooth, effortless fashion. So hinge and round at the same time, everything moves back and up. We touch the toes, we come back up. Nice and easy, getting a rhythm there, then coming back up. Now, as a little bonus here, a lot of times people will have easier times moving into one hip versus the other. So if that's the case for you, what you can do is stagger your feet a little bit where you have one behind the other and then still move the hips straight back. But by nature of having the staggered stance, you're gonna open up the hip with the back foot a little bit more than the hip with the front foot. I would still suggest that if this is the case, you practice on both sides, get a clear understanding of what the difference is between the sides, and work on both until they feel pretty much equal, and then go back to your more symmetrical variation and just double check that you can still load with equal pressure through both feet. All right, so there you have it. You gotta put those two skills together, both in rounding the spine and in opening up that pelvis in order to touch your toes. You can use that staggered stance to be able to detect asymmetries between the left and right and work on them until they're equal. Now, if you like this simple approach and you want to dive a little bit deeper with other simple techniques that you can use to improve movement, then go down to the link in the description and consider signing up for my educational program, Total Body Restoration. We look at asymmetry, posture, and breathing to get you moving and feeling the way you want. So as always, thanks a lot for watching this. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all the stuff. It helps the algorithm to help me, help you, and other people. So until next time, peace.